you believe in a moderate Islam? If so, what does moderate Islam look like? Someone wants to ask.
I do not believe in a moderate Islam, and I cannot describe what it looks like because it never has been seen in the world, and no one has ever been able to spot it. A moderate Islam meaning the teachings of some sect involving peaceful coexistence as equals with unbelievers. There is no sect of Islam that teaches that. People talk about, will say, what about the Sufis? The Sufis tend to be mystical, and they put a mystical slant on things that other Muslims don't. But the Sufis have never rejected violent jihad. They've been the leaders of the Chechen jihad for a couple centuries.
So that's good information. Can we stop there, though? So maybe,
yes, sure,
maybe listeners, you've heard about the Chechen rebels. Maybe not, but can you real quick, because I think that's significant, because I never knew that until I talked to you last time. Can you explain people briefly, if you can, who are the Chechen rebels, and why is it significant to say that they're Sufi in their leaning?
Chechnya is a Caucasian republic that is part of Russia, and Caucasian meaning that it's in the Caucasus Mountains. And speaking of racism, the Tamerlan Tsarnaev and Dzhokhar, his brother, the Boston Marathon bombers, they were from the Caucasus Mountains, so they were Caucasian jihadis.
Right.
But in the classic sense,
in the most technical sense of the word, yes.
Yes, exactly. But in any case, the Chechens have been fighting against Russian rule since the beginning of the 1800s, and they are Sufis. They see no incompatibility between Sufism and waging jihad against the Russians. Now, to be sure, in the late 20th century and in this century, there's been a lot of influence from the Saudis, and they're not Sufis. And so they have taken over to a tremendous degree the Chechen jihad, but up until then, it was all Sufis.
Well, let me ask you this. Why are we saying they're jihadis? Why aren't they just rebels against Russian oppression?
Well, they believe in jihad. They are waging jihad against the Russians, not just a war to free Chechnya from Russian dominance, but to spread Islam spread Islam in as much of the surrounding area and into Russia as much as they possibly can. But in the first place, they're fighting what is known as a defensive jihad against the invaders. And then that does not cancel out the further requirement in Islamic law to wage offensive jihad to spread Islam and its hegemony around the world.
Before I go on to chapter 7, I don't know if you want to briefly address this. Someone says, the bad ideas don't come from the Quran, they come from the Hadith. So the Hadith need to be removed, and what is publicly is accepted as Islam, or at least the concept moderate Islam. They're saying, I think that if you remove the Hadith, then you'll have moderate Islam. Do you have a quick response to that before we move on?
Yeah, sure. In the first place, the Hadith, let's just make sure everybody understands, are the reports of Muhammad's words and deeds. And because the Quran says that Muhammad is the excellent example for Muslims, that's chapter 33, verse 21, then his example is normative, and where those Hadith are considered authentic, there are a lot of fakes, but where Islamic scholars consider the Hadith to be authentic, then they become normative for Islamic law. Now, there is a lot of bad material in the Hadith, and so the person writing is a Quranist.
Yes, they are. The next
minority
question
group
was asking if you had heard of that. Yes.
It's a small minority sect within Islam, very small, of people who believe in the Quran alone. And the problem with that is it's incoherent in a lot of ways. One is the Quran tells you repeatedly in chapter 4, verse 80, and many, many other places, to obey Muhammad, to obey Allah and his messenger. Now, the Quran only mentions Muhammad by name 4 times and tells you virtually nothing about what he was like and what he did. So how on earth can you obey the messenger without knowing anything about him? And so you got to have the Hadith. That's what the Hadith are for, so that you can obey Allah and his messenger as the Quran commands. So in the first place, that's the reason why there've never been Quranists in Islamic history, because it's an incoherent position. But also, even if you take the Quran alone, you ain't going to get moderate Islam by a long shot, because you're going to still have, when the sacred months are over, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, slay the idolaters wherever you find them, arrest them, besiege them, lie in ambush everywhere for them. That's 9:5 of the Quran. 489, slay them wherever you find them. 2:191. Slay them wherever you find them. You sensing a pattern here? 47:4. When you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks, that is, behead them. 8:39. Fight them until religion is all for Allah. If religion is all for Allah, that means that what's the matter with the unbelievers? They must be all dead or converted to Islam. Maybe submitting to Islamic rules, since 929 tells you to fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, which is primarily Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, the tax, with willing submission, and feel themselves subdued. So you can subdue or subjugate the Jews and Christians without making them convert. But even that then denies basic rights to the non-Muslims. So even if you take Quran only, you're going to be killing a lot of unbelievers. And that does not make for a peaceful, harmonious, pluralistic society.
Well, one last comment by this commenter, Tyvon Swanell. I do appreciate what he says. He says, I am a Muslim and very much appreciate Robert's work. Not all of it, but many of the issues that he brings up are pertinent to modern conversations on Islamic extremism. So I appreciate that perspective. He was the one asking those questions, and I thought they were good questions, and I thought you had good answers. All right. So I imagine you're familiar with another man who wants to be an Islamic reformer of sorts here in Scottsdale, Arizona. Zhudi.
Yeah, my old pal, Zhudi Jasser, sure. I had a debate with him you can find on YouTube. That's one thing. But also about, it's 10 or 11 years ago now, I was on the phone with him because David Horowitz and I were doing an initiative to get Muslim groups to denounce the genocidal hadith. The genocidal hadiths are reports of Muhammad's words and deeds. And if they're considered authentic, then they're normative for Islamic law. And this hadith says, Muhammad says in it, at the end times will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And the Jews hide behind trees, and the trees cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." Now, this is in canonical hadith. In other words, it's considered authentic, and you find lots of jihadis quoting it. And anyway, I was talking to Zhudi Jasser, and I asked him if he would condemn this genocidal hadith. We were trying to get Muslim organizations all over the U.S. to condemn it. None would, interestingly enough. And Zhudi said, well, I don't think he really said that. And I said, well, it's in Bukhari, it's in Muslim. Those are the hadith collections that are considered most authentic by Muslims themselves. So why not? Where else do you go to find what he really said? And he said, I said, will you condemn it on the basis that Hamas thinks it's authentic? Lots of jihadis think it's authentic. And he said, okay, I'll do that as long as your name's not on it. And I said, well, me? What's wrong with me? And he said, you wrote a biography of Muhammad, which I did. The Truth About Muhammad. You got that one?
No, is that the...
Oh, alas. Hang on.
I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that's the book where Robert attempts to make the case that it's possible Muhammad did not exist. Is that the one?
No, that one's Did Muhammad Exist?
Okay.
This one is the biography. The Truth About Muhammad is a biography of Muhammad from the earliest Muslim sources. Get yours now.
I do have
anyway.
I do have one. I do have a biography.
Oh, yeah. The Life of Muhammad is a good book. That's the Sirat Rasulullah from Ibn Ishaq. That's the earliest biography of Muhammad. My book, The Truth About Muhammad, is taken from that and from Bukhari and Muslim when they are biographical about Muhammad, and from Ibn Sa'd, who was another early biographer of Muhammad. Anyway, so I asked Zhudi, what's the matter? You know, I wrote this biography of Muhammad. Yeah. And he said, well, the problem is you made Muhammad out to be a warlord and a pedophile. And I said, look, I worked from Ibn Ishaq, the book you just held up, and from Ibn Sa'd and Bukhari and Muslim. What was I supposed to use? And he said, oh, no, those are the sources, but I just don't think that Muhammad was like that. And I said, what was he like? Where do you find what he was really like? And he said, you know, my grandfather told me Muhammad was a wonderful man. And he did not, in other words, dispute the sources I was using. He didn't say I should have used other sources. He didn't say those sources are unreliable. All he said was that he has his own private Muhammad, who's a nice guy. And Zhudi is a nice guy himself, but he has his own private Islam that is Zhudiism that has no basis in Islamic tradition or history.
So you're saying,
like if I were to say,
you like...
If I was... Yeah, go ahead, boss.
I think you're saying you like Zhudi and you think what he's doing is good, but his idiosyncratic version of Muhammad is not one who really existed, and also is not in the minds of most Muslims, and therefore,
Yeah,
perhaps his reforms.
that's why he has such a small following among Muslims.
That's what I was.
That's why hardly any Muslims follow him. He has a much bigger following among non-Muslims.
Can I ask you this?
But
you can.
It's also, just a second, it's also misleading because people see him on TV all the time and they think, oh, that's the real Muslim. He's a nice guy, an ordinary guy, so we don't have anything to worry about because most Muslims are like him, when actually very few Muslims are like him. Go ahead.
You can decline if you want, but if you had a chance, let's just say Zhudi, he's like, oh, here's a local guy interviewed at Robert Spencer. Let me watch his Vocab Malone video because he's in Phoenix. If you were able to say, Zhudi, leave Muhammad and come to Jesus, do you have a 1-minute appeal that you would give to him, for example?
Well, I'm not a Christian evangelist, and I don't go around making appeals like that. Certainly, I think that would be a fine thing for Zhudi to do. I also think it would be a fine thing for Zhudi to simply examine his premises and determine that they are not reasonable or logical or based on fact. And if he were to discard some of the falsehoods that he is spreading, I think that would be progress in any case.
What if he said, Robert, you follow Jesus, why should I? What if he said that? He kind of
well, sure. If he asks me, I'll tell him. I mean, obviously, yes, I am a Christian, and I understand that Christians have a responsibility to spread the faith. And so, sure, I could discuss it with him. I mean, obviously, in the Quran, there are many things that are very odd. Jesus is the Word of God. Muhammad is not. Jesus is sinless in Islamic tradition. Muhammad is not, although he is de facto. And Jesus is born of a virgin. Muhammad is not. He speaks in the cradle. Muhammad doesn't. That's something from apocryphal gospels that the Quran picks up. And he is taken up into heaven at the end of his life. Muhammad is not. All these things are in the Quran with the exception of the sinless part, which is in Islamic tradition. And Islamic tradition also holds the Hadith as Muhammad saying that that Jesus will return at the end of the world. Not him, but Jesus. So you got to wonder, if Muhammad is the greater prophet, then why does Jesus have all these things about him that Muhammad doesn't have? Now, the answer is because the people who are putting together the Quran and Islam took a lot of things from Christianity that they didn't understand and stuck them in. And they're not consistent with the premises of Islam. But also, they can show a Muslim that there's a little bit more than meets the eye here, get him to start thinking critically, and that can lead to all kinds of things.
This is the last question I'll ask about Zhudi, and then we'll move on to chapter 8, I promise. Because I'm just curious, what if he said, what's one good reason I should follow Christ and not Muhammad? What if he asked you that specific question?
Well, you look at Christian civilization and Muslim civilization, and you can say, oh, Christian civilization is terrible, and look at the Indians, and look at whatever, the Inquisition, and this and that. And there's no doubt that sin is everywhere, and there's no person who is free from it. But if you look overall at Islamic civilization and Christian civilization, you have two very different views of the human person, two very different views of the nature of society. And it is the free societies of the West today that come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And it's no accident that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Jews lived 17 million in Europe and 1 million in Islamic lands. They were voting with their feet. They knew where life was better. People talk about the Christian persecution of the Jews. There's no doubt that happened. And Christian anti-Semitism, there's no doubt about it. And Hitler coming later on. And I'm talking about the beginning of the 20th century with 17 million and the 1 million. But the fact is that they knew that they would be subjected to greater persecution and harassment in Islamic lands.
Ooh.
And that remains true to this day.
Actually,
and this is one element of the fact that the civilization that comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition is simply better for human life in general than the civilization that comes out of Islamic tradition.
That's something provocative that I want to get your response on. They said,
I'm all for provocative statements.
They said, I think Zhudi is practicing tactical deceit, as in taqiyya, which is under some understandings of Islam, an allowance to lie to unbelievers. Do you believe that's the case?
In the first place, let me just clarify. It's not just some understandings of Islam. It's all understandings of Islam because it's in the Quran. Chapter 3, verse 28 of the Quran says, do not take unbelievers as your friends and protectors in preference to believers. Whoever does this has nothing to do with Allah unless you were doing it to guard yourselves against them. Now, unless you were doing it to guard yourselves against them, if you go to the commentaries, the tafsir on the Quran, you will find Ibn Kathir, for example, a very mainstream and popular commentator on the Quran, Muslim commentator on the Quran, quoting one of the companions of Muhammad. His immediate disciples were called companions, Abu ad-Darda. And Abu ad-Darda says, we smile in the faces of some people, but behind their backs we curse them. So this is something, it's Quranic, this deception, and it is sanctified by the example of the companions. So, that being said, is Zhudi deceiving? Nobody can know that except Zhudi. And that is something that only he can tell us. And if he is, he ain't going to tell us. All we can do is evaluate the truth or falsehood of what he's saying. And what he's saying when it comes to Islam is not true or accurate.
Yeah, this is interesting. I just pulled out the Study Quran to see what they had to say about that. It's a pretty interesting...
That's a massive exercise in deception, that whole book.
It's a pretty interesting...
I've written a couple of articles about
it. Oh, you have? Where can people find those?
Goodness. Well, certainly on Jihad Watch. If you put in the Study Quran, you'll find them.
Okay.
I analyzed a few of their exegeses, of their explanations of Islamic, of passages in the Quran, and they're just ridiculous. For example, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. That's chapter 48, verse 29. You read the Study Quran, and they go round and round and round and turn it around until it essentially means Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are really nice to the unbelievers. Now, that's just the opposite of what it actually says.
Right.
And the way that they get there is this convoluted wordplay that is ridiculous on its face. They say that in the first place, what they mean is that you have to be stern with people and telling them truths they don't want to hear.
Right.
And so that's the ruthlessness to the unbelievers that is meant. So you have to be harsh with them and calling them to the truth they don't want, which is Islam. And so that means you're being even more merciful to them because you are calling them to Islam.
Right.
So they end up with it being those who follow him are merciful to one another and even more merciful to the unbelievers.
Right.
It's a lot of silliness.
Hey, everyone.
I want to hear what the Study Quran said about 328.
Oh, okay. So it's rather long, so I'm going to read one part that I found especially relevant to it that kind of actually surprised me that what they said. So listen to this. This is on page 139. The concept of taqiyya is often associated more strongly with the Shiites, since during the period of the Imams until about the mid-3rd to 9th century, taqiyya was considered an important virtue in Shiite piety. That in itself is interesting. Though it was later de-emphasized when the Shiites constituted a large number and as the political position of Shiism became less insecure. Taqiyya, however, continued throughout the history of Shiism and is still considered legitimate when circumstances necessitate it. The Sunni view toward taqiyya is substantially the same at a legal and political level, though the terminology might differ. At a spiritual level, taqiyya has also been used in both Shiite Islam and the Sufi tradition in Sunni Islam in the context of hiding or concealing spiritual teachings that are not appropriate for everyone.
Well, there you go. Just hiding spiritual teachings that are not appropriate for everyone. It's not appropriate for American non-Muslims to know that Islam is a religion of warfare and conquest. And so this is operative in that sense right now among Muslim spokesmen in the U.S.
So if I did have a chance to speak to, say, a Muslim like a Zhudi Jasser, and he said, why should I follow Jesus? There's so many things I would say, but let me share one thing. This is from the book of Matthew. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. And starting in chapter 11, looking at verse 25, it says, at that time Jesus said, so Jesus here is speaking, and listen to how he speaks about his Father. I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and revealed them in infants. Yes, Father, because this was your good pleasure. All things have been entrusted to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. Let me just real quick say something about that. Do you hear the intimate language with how Jesus speaks of God the Father? This is not merely a relationship where it's just a prophet. This is a relationship where you have Trinitarian communication. And yes, I understand the Trinity is not something you believe in, but just listen to what God says about himself in a passage like this, because there's a Father and the Son, and yet there is no consort. That's not the type of relationship we're talking about here. And he's the Lord of heaven and earth, this Father. And he reveals these beautiful things, not to the wise and intelligent or to the strong, but to infants. And there's a humility there that's a challenge that and the gospel gives to us, that we would be humbled. But we can only be humbled if we really understand who God is and who we are. And I just want to say the Quran doesn't really explain to you or show you who God really is. But if you really see how big and grand and majestic he is, and you see who we really are, you'll see that God is perfect, and his standard is perfect, and he demands perfection, and we all fall short. And because of that, we must pay, and no animal can pay for us. Mere words can't pay for us. God demands real justice. But the Son satisfied that justice. And look at this relationship, though, between the Son and the Father. This is more than just a prophet-God relationship. All things have been entrusted to me by my Father. Do you hear that? I challenge you. Could Muhammad speak that way about Allah? No, of course not. No one knows the Son except the Father. There's an intimacy there. This is a closeness. This is something different with Jesus from anyone else who has ever lived. No one knows the Father except the Son. And that's why only the Son can really reveal who God is to the creation, not Muhammad. We don't need another prophet. And anyone to whom the Son desires to reveal him. So that's where we ask, Father, reveal your Son to me. Jesus, reveal God to me. We can ask this because it's based upon his doing, and that is an honorable request. And I want to read these last two verses here. Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Do you hear that? Jesus says, come to me. Not just coming to a book, not just coming to a set of principles, not coming to sort of a religious system. He's saying, come to me. The center of this thing is Jesus. It's focused on a person. And that would be wrong and idolatrous if he was a mere man or a mere prophet or a mere Rasul. He is God embodied. A scandalous but true idea. And I will give you rest. There's no way to find rest in keeping commands and trying to do this and that. It's by coming humbly to Christ. He gives us true rest. We take up his yoke. And so he gives us rest. But then there's a yoke. What is it? It's a yoke of discipleship. Learn from me. Learn what it means to be truly one who's in love with God. Not from Muhammad, not from even merely a book, although clearly God's word are contained here, but from Jesus himself. Because he is lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. That's a desire that will not be met in Islam. For his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And yet, what did he do? Jesus took on the burden of our sin. And he took on our burdens willingly because we couldn't carry them, so to speak. We couldn't pay for them, and died for our sins. Now, I know that I'm not as articulate as I would have liked right there, and I know that today's broadcast wasn't perfect, but I do thank Robert for joining me. But I also want to point to Christ ultimately, because he's the answer to these questions. And I pray that people can see that. Thank you for watching, everybody. Have a great day.